on the seven churches as revealed in the book of Revelations, the second and the third chapters. Now, the book of Revelation was written in AD 96. The writer was the Apostle John, better known as the beloved Apostle. He was told to write the things which he saw and heard. The book, therefore, is a divinely given book and is the revelation of Jesus Christ and not of John. It is the most important and valuable prophetic book in the Bible. All through the Old Testament, there are shadow references to things which are to come to pass in the latter days. The book of Revelation reveals the divine program. In order in which these events are to happen, it is the book of consummation, and its proper place in the sacred canon is where it is placed at the end of the Bible. The book is full of action. Earth and heaven are brought near together. The clouds roll away. Thrones, elders, and angelic forms are seen. Harps, trumpets, cries from disembodied souls, and choruses of songs are heard. Earth touches heaven, and alas, it touches hell also. There are strong moral contrasts, good and evil meet. There is no blending, but sharp contrast, and with a long, protracted conflict that ends in victory for the good. The book is addressed to the seven churches which are in Asia. By Asia is not meant the great continent of Asia, or even the whole of Asia Minor, but only its western end. Neither were the seven churches named the only churches in that district, for there were at least three other churches. These seven churches then must be representatives of typical churches chosen for certain characteristics typical of the character of the Church of Christ from the end of the first century down to the time of Christ's return for his church, and descriptive of the seven church periods, clearly defined in church history. John, when he received this message, was a prisoner on the Isle of Patmos. He heard behind him a great voice as of a trumpet, and when he turned, he saw the seven golden candlesticks, and standing in their midst, one like unto the Son of Man, who held in his right hand seven stars. He was told that the seven stars were the angels, ministers or messengers of the seven churches, and the seven candlesticks represented the seven churches. Lampstand is a better translation for the word candlestick, and is so given in the margin of our Bibles. A candlestick requires a light which is self-consuming like a lampstand. It's simply the holder of a lamp whose light is fed from a reservoir of oil, thus typifying the heart of the Holy Spirit. Thus Christ looks upon the churches as not the light, but simply the light holder. The use of the figures lampstands and stars, which are only for service in the night, indicates that we are living in the night of this age. The key to the interpretation of the book of Revelation is its threefold division. Things past, the things which thou hast seen, the vision of Christ in the midst of the lampstands. Second, things present, the things which are. Obviously, the seven churches, chapter 2 and 3, John was not far from 100 years old and the only remaining apostle. The temple and the city of Jerusalem had been destroyed, and the Jews dispersed 26 years before. And John's attention was called to the condition of the seven representations, churches of Asia. Number 3, things future, the things which shall be hereafter. Beginning with the 4th chapter unto the end of the book, it is worthy of note that the messages to the seven churches are inserted between two visions. The vision of Christ in the midst of the seven lampstands in chapter 1, and the vision of the 4 and 20 elders round about the throne in chapter 4. As chapter 4 is a vision of the glorified church, with the Lord after it has been called out, then the second division of the book, the things which are, and which includes chapters 2 and 3, must be a description or prophetic outline of the spiritual history of the church from the time when John wrote the book in AD 96 down to the taking out of the church, or else we have no prophetic view of the church during that period. For she disappears from the earth at the close of chapter 3 and is not seen again until she reappears with the Lord in chapter 19. This we shall find to be the case. This interpretation of the messages to the seven churches, which are hidden to the early church because time was required for church history to develop and be written. So a comparison could be made to reveal the correspondence. It had been clearly revealed that the seven churches stood for seven church periods or dispensations that would have to elapse before Christ could come back. The incentive to watch would have the outset. While the character of these seven churches is descriptive of the church during seven periods of our history, we must not forget that the condition of those seven churches as described with their exact condition in John's day. So we see that at the close of the first century, the leaven of the false doctrine was at work in the churches. The churches are given in the order name because the peculiar characteristics of that church apply to the period of church history to which it is assigned. It also must not be forgotten that which it is distinctive characteristic of each church period does not disappear with that period, but continues on down through the next period and so on until the end, thus increasing the imperfections of the visible church until its end is in an open apostasy as shown on the chart. The message to the seven churches compared with church history. We will not consider each church separately. The message to the church of Ephesus. The complaint that Christ makes against the church is that it had left its first love. Its character is seen in its very name. For Ephesus means to let go, to relax. It had become a backslidden church. Paul, who founded it, warned it of what should happen in his parting message. I know this, that after my departing shall grievous wolves enter in among you, not sparing the flock. Also of your own self shall men arise, speaking perverse things, to draw away disciples after them. The significance of this warning is seen in the condemnation of the message. Verse 6, but this thou hast, that thou hatest the deeds of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. Here Paul's wolves are called Nicolaitans. They were not except but a party in the church who were trying to establish a priestly order, probably trying to model the church after the Old Testament order of priests, Levites, and common people. This is seen in the meaning of the word, which is from Nico, to conquer, to overthrow, and laos, the people or laity. The object was to establish a holy order of men and place them over the laity, which was foreign to the New Testament plan, and called them not pastors but clergy, bishops, archbishops, cardinals, popes. Here we have the origin of the dogma of the apostolic succession and the separation of the clergy from the laity, a thing that God hates. The church at Ephesus was not deceived, but recognized them as false apostles and liars. The character of the church at Ephesus is a fair outline of the church period from AD 70 to 100 to AD 170. The message to the church of Smyrna, the church in its Ephesian period, having lost its first love, Lord is now absent is about to chastise it, so as to cause it to return to Smyrna has for its root meaning bitterness. It means myrrh, and has been associated with death, and we see in the meaning of the word prophecy of the persecution and death, which was to befall the members of the Smyrna church. They were told not to fear the things that they shall be called out to suffer, but to be faithful unto death, not until death, that is, not until the end of the natural life. They were not to recant. When called upon to face him at his death, that remain faithful until death, relieve them of their sufferings. The reward would be a crown of life. This is the martyr's crown. They were told that the author of their sufferings would be the devil, and its duration would be 10 days, which was doubtless a prophetic reference to the 10 great persecutions under the Roman Empire, beginning with Nero AD 64 and ending with Demolition AD 310. 7 of these great persecutions occurred during the Smyrna period of church history, or it may refer to the 10 years of the last and fiercest persecutions under the Roman Empire. This period extended from AD 170 to Constantine AD 312. The message to the church at Pergamos, in this message, Pergamos is spoken of as Satan's seat. When the priest king of the Chaldean hierarchy fled before the conquering Persians to Pergamos and settled there, Satan shifted his capital from Babylon to Pergamos. At first he persecuted the followers of Christ, and Antipas was one of the martyrs. But soon he changed his tactics and began to exalt the church, and through Constantine united the church and state, and offered all kinds of inducement for worldly people to come into the church. Constantine's motive was more political than religious. He wished to weld his Christian and pagan subjects into one people, and so consolidate his empire. The result of this union was that 2 false and pernicious doctrines crept into the church. The first was the doctrine of Balaam, and the second the doctrine of the Nicolaitans. The latter we have already considered under the message to the church of Ephesus, and the foothold it had secured in the church was seen in the first great council of the church held at Nicaea in AD 325. The council was composed of about 1,500 delegates. The laymen outnumbered the bishops 5 to 1. It was a stormy council, full of integrity and political methods, and from the supremacy of the clergy over the laity, it was evident that the doctrine of the Nicolaitans had secured a strong and permanent foothold. The doctrine of Balaam is disclosed in the story of Balaam found in the book of Numbers, chapters 22 to 25 inclusive. When the children of Israel on their way to Caetta had reached the land of Moab, Balak the king of Moab sent for Balaam, the son of Beor, who lived at Pethor on the river Euphrates, to come and curse them. When the Lord would not permit Balaam to curse Israel, he suggested to Balak that he invite them to the lentitious feast of Baal Peor, and thus cause Israel to fall into a snare that would so anger the Lord that he would himself destroy them. This Balak did, and the result was that when the men of Israel went to those sensual feasts and saw the daughters of Moab, they committed whoredoms with them, which so kindled God's anger that he sent a plague that destroyed 32,000 of them. Now the word Pergamos means marriage. And when the church entered into a union with the state, it was guilty of spiritual fornication or Balaamism. The Balaam method that Constantine employed was to give to the bishops of the church a number of imposing buildings called basilicas, or conversions into churches, for whose decoration he was lavish in a gift of money. He also supplied superb vestments for the clergy, and soon the bishop found himself clad in costly vestments, seated on a lofty throne in the apse of the basilica, with a marble altar adorned with gold and gems, and on a lower level in front of him. A sensuous form of worship was introduced. The character of the preaching was changed, and the great pagan festivals were adopted with but little alteration. To please the pagan members of the church and attract pagans to the church, for illustration, as the winter solstice falls on the 21st day of December, which is the shortest day in the year, was regarded throughout the heathen world as the birthday of the sun god, and was a high festival which was celebrated at Rome by the great games of the circus, which was celebrated at Rome by the great games of the circus. It was found advisable to change the birthday of the son of God from April, at which time it was probably born, to December 25th, because he was the son of righteousness. What more appropriate birthday could he have than the birthday of the pagan sun god? The message to the church at Thyatira, in his condemnation of this church, Christ raised the emphasis on their works, as if they depended on them and claimed they deserved merit for works. But he had a complaint to make against them that was terrible in its awfulness. He charged them not merely with permitting a bad woman, Jezebel, who called herself a prophetess, to remain in the church, but with permitting her to teach her pernicious doctrines and to seduce the servants to commit fornication and to eat things sacrificed to idols. Who this woman was is a question. She was a pretender and called herself a prophetess. Probably she was of noble lineage. She certainly was a woman of commanding influence. Whether her real name was Jezebel or not, she was so like her prototype in the Old Testament, Jezebel, the wife of Ahab, that Christ called her by that name. Jezebel, the wife of Ahab, was not by birth a daughter of Abraham, but a princess of a adulterous Tyre, at a time, too, when its royal family was famed for cruel savagery and intense devotion to Baal and Ashtarti. Her father, Edbaal, a priest of the latter deity, murdered the reigning monarch Palacius and succeeded him. Ahab, king of Israel, to strengthen his kingdom, married Jezebel, and she aided and abated by Ahab, introduced the licentious worship of Baal into Israel, and killed all the prophets of the Lord she could lay her hands on. And this influence she exercised not only while her husband was alive, but also during the reign of her two sons, Ahaziah and Jehoram. Moreover, the marriage of a daughter, Athaliah, to Joram, son of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, introduced idolatrous worship into Judah, and it was not long before there was a house of Baal built in Jerusalem, and so Jezebel caused all Israel to sin after the sin of Jehoram, the son of Nebat. There is no question that whether Jezebel was a real person or not, she typifies a system, and that system was the Papal Church. When the Papal Church introduced images and pictures into its churches for the people to bow down to, it became adulterous. And when it set up its claims that the teaching of the church is superior to the Word of God, it assumed the role of prophetess. A careful study of the papal system from AD 606 to the Reformation, AD 1520, with its institution of the sacrifice of the Mass and other pagan rites, revealed in its sway of Jezebelinism. It was also a period of Jezebelinistic persecution, as seen in the wars of the Crusades and the rise of the Inquisition. A careful comparison of this message with the parable of the leaven will reveal the wonderful correspondence between the two. That the Jezebel of the church of Caetta, being the woman of the parable, inserted the leaven of the false doctrine into the meal of the gospel. This period extended from AD 606 to the Reformation, AD 1520. Now to the fifth church. The church of Sardis was called a dead church, though it had come to life. That is, it was a formalistic church, a church given over to formal, a realistic worship. It had the form of godliness without the power. The meaning of the word Sardis is the escaping one, or those who come out, and so it is an excellent type of the church of the Reformation period. By the Reformation we mean that period in the history of the Christian church when Martin Luther and a number of other reformers protested against the false teachings, tyranny, and claims of the Roman Catholic Church. This period began about AD 1500. The condition of affairs in the realm dominated by the Papal Church became intolerable and came to a crisis when Martin Luther, on October 31, 1517 AD, nailed his 95 Theses on the church door at Wittenberg, Germany. From that date, the Reformation set in. But it was more a struggle for political liberty than a purely Christian or religious movement. It had the advantage of encouraging and aiding the circulation of the Holy Scriptures that had hitherto been a sealed book, the revival of the doctrine of justification by faith, and a revision to more bitter controversial contentions that while they threw much light on the Word of God, interfered greatly with the spiritual state of the church until it could truthfully be said she had a name to live and was dead. While the Reformers swept away much realistic and doctrinal rubbish, they failed to discover the promise of the second advent. They turned to God from idols, but not to wait for His Son from heaven. The Sardis period extended from AD 1520 to about AD 1750. The message to the Church of Philadelphia. There is no question about the meaning of the word Philadelphia. It means brotherly love. And well described the charity and brotherly fellowship that dissipated the bitter personal admonishings that made possible the evangelistic and missionary labors of the past 150 years. Three things are said of this church. It had a little strength. It was like a person coming back to life who was still very weak. It was the dead Sardis church revived, and revivals have been characteristics of the Philadelphia period. These revivals began with George Whitefield in AD 1739, followed by John Wesley, Charles G. Finney, and D.L. Moody. It had been said before in an open door that no man could shut. Note that this promise was made to him who had the key of David. He had opened it and no man shut it, and shut it and no man opened it. In 1793, William Carey sailed for India, where he found an open door. And since then, the Lord has opened the door into China, Japan, Korea, India, Africa, and the isles of the sea, until there is not a country in the world where the missionary cannot go. It was to be kept from the hour of temptation, that is tribulation period, that shall come upon all the earth, as the church at Philadelphia is still in existence, and the only one of the seven that has survived of the Smyrna period, it has never yet suffered in a persecution that was worldwide. The hour of temptation, then, must be still future, and refers doubtless to the great tribulation. That is to come upon the whole world, just before the return of the Lord to set up His millennial kingdom. And as the promise is that the Philadelphia church shall not pass through the tribulation, it is not this additional proof that the church shall be caught out before the tribulation. The Philadelphia period covers the time between A.D. 1750 and A.D. 1900. We must not forget that the characteristics of all these periods continue on in the church down to the end. This is true of the evangelistic and missionary movement of the Philadelphia period. But they are now more mechanical and based on business method, and there is less spiritual power and will continue until Christ returns. The message to the church at Laodicea, that is, the seventh church. Christ has no commendation for this church, but to complaint of, he says, I know thy works, that thou art neither cold nor hot. I would thou wert cold nor hot. So then, because thou art lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I will spew thee out of my mouth. There is nothing more disgusting or nauseating than tepid water. So there is nothing more repugnant to Christ than a tepid church. He would rather have a church frozen or boiling. It was the chilly spiritual atmosphere of the Church of England that drove John Wesley to start those outside meetings which became so noted for their religious fever. And it was the same chilly atmosphere of the Methodist Church that drove William Booth in turn to become a red-hot Salvationist. Our churches today are largely in this lukewarm condition. There is very little of the warm-hearted spirituality. There is much going on in them, but it is largely mechanical and of a social character. Committees, societies, and clubs are multiplied, but there is an absence of spiritual heat. Revival meetings are held, but instead of waiting on the Lord for power, and evangelists and paid singers are hired, and soul winning is made a business. The cause of this lukewarmness is the same as that of the church of Laodicea, self-deception. Because thou sayest I am rich and increased with goods, and have need of nothing, and knowest not that thou art wretched and miserable, and poor and blind and naked. They thought they were rich, and outwardly they were. But Christ saw the poverty of their heart. There are many such churches in the world today, more so than in every other period in the history of the church. Many of these churches have cathedral-like buildings, stained glass windows, eloquent preachers, paid singers, large congregations. Some of them have large land interests and are well endowed, and yet they are poor. Many of the members, if not the majority, are worldly, card-playing and dancing and theater-going Christians. The poor and the saintly are not wanted in such churches because their presence is a rebuke. These churches do not see that they are wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked. If we were to visit such churches, they would take pride in showing us the building. They would praise the preaching and singing. They would boast of the character of their congregation, the exclusiveness of their membership, the attractiveness of all of their services. But if we suggested a series of meetings for the deepening of the spiritual life or the conversion of the unsaved, they would say, oh no, we do not want such meetings. We have need of nothing. The church of Laodicea was not burdened with debt, but it was burdened with wealth. The trouble with the church today is that it thinks that nothing can be done without money, and that we only have the money, the world would be converted into this generation. The world is not to be converted by money, but by the Spirit of God. The trouble with the church of Laodicea was that its gold was not of the right kind. And silver was counselled to buy the Lord, gold tried in the fire. What kind of gold is that?